Welcome back. The Free Speech Union is to sue the government over the Education Secretary's decision to halt a law protecting academics and students against cancel culture just days before the law was going to come into force. Bridget Phillipson claims that the law would have encouraged hate speech on campuses, putting students from minority groups at risk. Just 1 month into the government, Labour has already appeared to be sending a signal that it doesn't hold free speech as an important right. It's easier for governments to use disorder and riots as an excuse to crack down on civil liberties, which is why backbenchers have warned against a proposed definition of Islamophobia that could stifle free speech. Well, I'm joined now by the director of the Free Speech Union, Toby Young. Toby, thank you very much for coming in. So you're making the lawyers rich again?
Well, judicial review is very expensive. And when I saw the estimate from the lawyers of how much it could cost, that was pretty sobering. But I think that someone has to challenge the government, particularly over this issue of free speech. This is really the first salvo the government has fired in what I think will be a war against free speech. So unless we put a marker down now, they'll just have a free hand to ride roughshod over one of our most precious values.
And on a technical point, this act has passed through Parliament. What bit of it are they stopping?
So various clauses which established a complaints scheme which would be overseen by the Office for Students, as well as a new statutory tort which would have enabled students, faculty members, visiting speakers who thought that a university in England had breached their right to free speech, they could sue them in the county court under this new statutory tort. So essentially the enforcement mechanisms, the complaint scheme and the statutory tort, which were due to come into force on August 1st, were paused by Bridget Phillipson, and we think that's an abuse of executive power. Though the Act was passed by both Houses of Parliament, it enjoyed cross-party support, it was in the Conservative Manifesto in 2019, we think this is an unlawful use of executive power.
And so it's the ministerial commencement that has been suspended?
Yes.
Okay. What practical differences?
Not quite suspended, it had already been commenced. So the clauses had been activated by the previous Education Secretary, but she essentially reversed
She overturned the commencement.
Your
legal action is very interesting, actually, and you may have, well, we'll see. But is Bridget Phillipson right that this could lead to people being abused at universities, of hate speech being protected, of nasty things happening, and that actually the cure in the Act is worse than the problem?
No, that is just straightforwardly false. So the new Act didn't really create more robust protections for academic freedom and free speech on English university campuses than were already in force since 1986, since the Education No. 2 Act 1986. What it did was it created these two enforcement mechanisms, what Bridget Phillipson has torpedoed, and those protections hadn't in the past protected hate speech on campus. They don't take priority over the legal duty to prevent terrorism being promoted on campus, and they don't take priority over the duty of universities to protect students from harassment.
But if those protections are already there, and there seems to have been a bit of a pushback in favour of freedom of speech at some universities anyway, wasn't this just setting up a bureaucratic apparatus that Conservatives should be against, another quango set of regulations and bother for universities that would have been expense?
I don't think so. The protections were already there, but because it was so difficult to hold universities' feet to the fire and make sure they kept faith with their own commitments to free speech in their policies, the only way to do that was via judicial review, which I've discovered is extremely expensive, time-consuming, cumbersome, difficult. These enforcement mechanisms that were created by the new Act were much easier to use, and it would have been much easier, therefore, to make sure universities did honour their commitment and didn't break it as often as they had in the past.
Now, as you've announced this, we've obviously got the row on freedom of speech in relation to online messages, the row about whether the far right are stoking crime and rioting. To what extent is it sensible for a government to try and stop crime being promoted online? And to what extent is the cover of riots something that governments use to clamp down on freedom of speech?
It's absolutely typical, I'm afraid, for the authorities to blame free speech whenever there's an outbreak of civil disorder and to use it as an excuse to clamp down on free speech. So in the Brixton riots, 1981, pirate radio was blamed for fomenting that disorder. In the riots in 2011, BlackBerry Messenger was blamed. And I think that actually, if you allow people to speak freely, if you don't restrict what they can say about episodes like the one that happened in Southport last week, you're much less likely to see outbreaks of this kind of disorder than if you try and suppress conversation and discussion about it online.
But people are saying that online platforms are allowing far-right groups to arrange for trainloads of people to go to towns and cities to riot. If that's happening, surely it's something you would want to crack down on.
I'm not sure that is happening, Jacob. I'm not sure I believe that. I'm not sure that actually the instigators of the disorder are from outside of the area. The authorities always say that. Community leaders always say that. There's this huge reluctance to acknowledge that the problem is local, is indigenous to the area where it's happening. They always blame outside agitators. I'm not sure that there's much in that.
It's happened in so many different places that it seems unlikely that people from all over the country have decided to go on a sort of Cook's tour of the country to riot.
Yeah, I mean, it's convenient, I think, for the current government to blame far-right agitators on what's been happening. No doubt that they've played a role, but it's much bigger than that.
So where do you think free speech actually stops problems? Because if you don't allow people to, say, go and write here on the internet, or if you don't allow people to put hateful comments up, doesn't that help clamp down on it? What would your approach be to openness in government, in policing, and why do you think that would stop the problem or reduce the problem?
Well, my position is the same as that of a Supreme Court justice called Louis Brandeis, who in the 1920s came up with what's known as the counter-speech doctrine. The best way to counter misleading, false or harmful speech, including hate speech, is more and better speech, not enforced silence. And one reason for that is not just because we have a right to free speech and often we can't trust the authorities to get it right when they identify certain speech as misinformation or hate speech. It's also because it's counterproductive. It has the opposite of its intended effect. And maybe the best illustration of this was that in the Weimar Republic in the 1920s, the Nazi Party was banned. Nazi Party newspapers were banned. Hitler was prevented from speaking in various German states. That enabled the Nazis to pose as martyrs, as people the authorities were scared of. It gave them a kind of glamour that they might otherwise not have had. Much better to rebut that kind of thing in the public square rather than force it underground.